So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. It's great to see folks in the room, and welcome to this session hosted by Sheffield Green Party. I'm going to hand over quite quickly to Natalie and Michael, but I just wanted to say thanks for coming, and there will be plenty of time for Q&A questions in the latter half of the session. We'll aim to wrap up by 8 p.m. So please use the chat panel to send in your questions, or when it comes to question time, if you want to speak your question aloud, you can use the raise hand function in Zoom as well. And Eamon and I will help Natalie and Michael moderate those questions and maybe group them if there's a lot, but hopefully we'll have time to get through plenty of them. But yeah, that's it. I think we might as well get started. So over to you, Natalie.
Thanks very much, Liam, and welcome everyone this evening. With Boris Johnson just having been addressing the UN General Assembly on the subject of COP26 and climate change, and sounding like a man who really gets the urgency. Of course, this is Boris Johnson, but that's what he was sounding like. We picked a great time to have this meeting. And as I was just saying, generally chatting, I was talking to the Cambridge Green Party about COP26 on Monday, and doing these meetings is going to be something that's going to take up a lot of my time, and I'll expect you to be in Glasgow for most or all of COP. But it's lovely to be back on familiar home territory, and having started the morning with Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk Radio at 8 this morning, this is an audience that I'm really, really looking forward to this evening. As Liam said, we're going to try and finish this at 8, so do get questions in early or get your hand up early. We always have a rush of people at the end, and we've got to try and squeeze as many in as we can. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to our guest speaker this evening, who I could almost say needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway in the traditional way. Michael Jacobs is Professor of Political Economy at the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute. Sperry is a lot easier to say. And his research focuses particularly on post-neoliberal political economy, climate change and environment policy. His most recent book, which he edited with Mariana Mazzucato, is Economics and Policy for the Sustainable and Inclusive Growth. He and I might have some different views on that last bit of that phrase, but we might get to that later along the way. And has a very long history going back to being a special advisor to Gordon Brown in 2007 to 2010, particularly on energy, environment and climate policy, and was there at the heart of the 2008 Climate Change Act, which very much still is a standout element of our life and climate policy today. So we're going to, Michael's going to talk for about 20 minutes. Then I might have a question or two, but then we'll go to Q&A, and we'll try and make this at least half Q&A, because I always think that dialogue's better than monologue. So without further ado, Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Natalie, and thank you for that introduction. And delighted to see so many people here. Thank you very much for coming, at least as far as your computer screens. I'm going to talk to some slides. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that you can see these. So if I show those, are those visible? Yep.
They are.
Yes.
Yep, that's
okay.
it, full screen now.
So
yep.
That's more or less my title. I didn't actually have a title, but I thought that's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what a COP is. I'm sure most people in this audience know, but just in case there's anybody not, and in particular, kind of what happens at a COP. And then I want to talk about the three major issues that are of importance at the COP. And then specifically to talk about, so I mean to have that one there, the third one as well, and then to talk about the specific problems that are going to arise at this particular meeting. So the COP is called a COP because it's the Conference of the Parties, and the parties are the signatories to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which is the international treaty agreed on climate change in 1992. The major agreement that has occurred recently, as you all know, is the Paris Climate Agreement, which was agreed in 2015 at COP21. And the reason that COP26 is important is because this is the moment under the Paris Agreement when countries have to strengthen their climate commitments. The Paris Agreement has a 5-year cycle. Every 5 years, first there's a stocktake of where we are on the science, and then after that, countries have to strengthen their commitments. And COP26 is the first moment of strengthening after Paris. It's actually 6 years on rather than 5, because COP26 was meant to occur last year, but was postponed because of COVID. The UK bid to hold this COP largely as part of its kind of global Britain reinvention in the government's eyes after Brexit, and decided on Glasgow as the host city. And the UK as the host is the presidency, the convener and the chair of the conference. So what exactly is a COP? Well, right at the heart of a COP are the negotiations. This is, in fact, what the Conference of the Parties is. It is a negotiation between all the different countries of the world and the EU, 197 countries in the EU, on the rules by which international action on climate change will occur. And much as at a party conference, which some of you may have been to, there is a meeting going on in the main hall. This is not, however, what most of the people going to the COP are doing. Most of the COP goes on around those negotiations, because as well as being a UN negotiation, it is also the world's global climate conference. And thousands and thousands of people, certainly in a normal year, and obviously this is not a normal year with COVID and international travel restrictions, but in a normal year, thousands and thousands of people attend the COP, but they never go near, and indeed mostly don't know what's going on in the actual negotiations, at least until the very end. So around those negotiations, you've got a whole number of other things going on. You've got some announcements in the real economy, if you like, in the economy of electricity and heating and transport and forestry and agriculture and so on, where often governments are trying to get announcements to be made. Then there are lots of other actors like businesses and cities, regions who are also coming to the COP to make announcements about their climate commitments. You've got NGOs, research institutes holding fringe meetings on all of these things. And of course, around the outside, not inside the security cordon, you've got the public and public demonstrations, which usually at COPs are a major part of the process. In the end, however, this is what a COP looks like, I think, which is that you have the negotiations at the end of a COP, and you have the public and the public view of them, including any demonstrations that might be occurring. And so the COP starts as a very big conference with many, many other actors and ends with the negotiations being paramount. There are three major issues which this COP will deal with. The first of which is emissions. As you will probably know, the Paris Climate Agreement committed the world's nations to limiting the rise in global average surface temperature to well below 2 degrees, and if possible, 1.5 degrees. Since Paris, the goal of 1.5 degrees of maximum heating has become established as the goal. The G7, for example, committed itself to that. So 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees, is still formally the goal of Paris, but it has been largely superseded by the 1.5 degree limit. But if you look at what actually the commitments that countries made in Paris, they didn't add up to a trajectory consistent with 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. And there is a large emissions gap, as it is called. And so the crucial role of the COP this year is to try and close the emissions gap to get emissions back to a 1.5 centigrade, or onto a 1.5 centigrade trajectory. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has provided that trajectory for us. We know that to get onto that trajectory, we need to be cutting emissions globally by around 45% by 2030, and to fall to net zero around 2050. So this is the moment when the emissions gap has to be closed. And this is the United Nations Environment Programme's picture of the emissions gap. The upper lines there are the commitments that countries have made. The red line is 2010, policies in 2010. The yellow lines and the blue line represent the additional commitments that the countries have entered into over the last 10 years. but the lower lines are the trajectories that the IPC says we need to be on to hit 2 degrees, to limit global heating to 2 degrees, that's the blue line, and the grey line at the bottom is 1.5 degrees. So you can see there is a major gap between the commitments that countries have made so far and where we need to be to achieve the Paris goal. And this is the first big issue of the COP. The second big issue is climate finance. Under the original UNFCCC treaty, developed countries are required to provide financial support to help developing countries reduce their emissions and to adapt to the climate change they're already experiencing. And at Copenhagen, which was COP15 in 2009, a COP where I was working with Gordon Brown, a goal of $100 billion a year by 2020 was agreed. This wasn't just money provided by governments to developing countries, but also by financial institutions through the actions and policies that governments took. So it included things from money from, for example, the World Bank and some private finance as well. The Paris Climate Agreement reiterated the goal and indeed said beyond 2020, we would need more than 100 billion. However, this number has never been reached. The OECD just this week produced its latest analysis of how much money was flowing in 2019, which was the last year for which we have the figures, and it was under $80 billion a year. The US this week, as you might have noticed, President Biden at the UN General Assembly in New York pledged an additional $6 billion, but this still won't take us to the 100 billion that is now a pledge that's over a decade old. So we also have a finance gap. And at COP26, the developed countries are being expected to show how they will hit the $100 billion a year commitment, which was meant to have been hit last year. That is a picture provided by the OECD of the finance that has flowed from north to south in that period. And as you can see, we're not yet at 100 billion. The third issue that I want to talk about is the one that's often neglected. In the north, in the UK, and the rich world, we most often talk about mitigation of climate change, what the UNFCCC calls mitigation, which is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in order to prevent future climate change. But for most of the countries of the south, the key issue is adaptation, often now called resilience. That is how they can tackle the climate change they are already experiencing, how they can, for example, install flood defenses or get foods that are more resistant to drought, or in other ways cope with the climate change that is already occurring. Their own emissions in most of the developing world are very low, so this is the thing that matters most to them. But it's always been the poor relation, both at the UN negotiations and in media debate and in financing, particularly because you can't get the private sector to invest very much in adaptation, unlike, for example, renewable energy. So far less money flows into it. So particularly the most vulnerable climate countries, most vulnerable to climate change, the small islands, the states that have large, long coasts and flat coasts, will be seeking to make adaptation and resilience a key issue at COP26. So the two biggest issues are emissions reductions and financing, particularly funds for adaptation and resilience. But COP26 has a problem. And the problem is that neither of these two issues are actually negotiated in the COP. They are decided, mainly by the big rich countries, in advance of the COP in the so-called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs in UN speak, which each country announces, and in separate climate finance announcements, often made at the G7 or G20 or at the UN or another global leaders summit. That's why, for example, President Biden made his commitment on climate finance at the UN General Assembly. It's why the EU announced that its emissions reduction commitments at its council in the spring. Some others did so at the G7 summit in Cornwall a few months ago. This means that the biggest issues that the COP has to deal with are actually likely to be settled in advance of the COP, leaving the negotiations themselves to decide only smaller issues concerning the rules. Now, COPs have a very specific and unique structure. Unlike most international meetings where very poor and small countries really have no voice at all, decisions at the COP are made by consensus. And the smaller, low-income countries, particularly those vulnerable to climate change, have a disproportionate voice in a COP because they are the ones who are experiencing climate change, but they did not cause it. It's been caused by the richer countries over the period of 200 years of industrialization and China's industrialization over the last 50. And so the question will arise at the COP. How are they going to react to a negotiation which is not really addressing the main issues, where the main issues have been decided in advance, and where we already know, because they've been decided in advance, that the emissions gap and the finance gap are not going to be closed sufficiently this year. So my picture of the COP then is that you have the negotiations, you have the public, and then the NDCs and the climate finance commitments are outside the negotiating process. But in some way, they need to be brought in to the main COP. What's the UK government, as the presidency of the COP, trying to do here? Well, because we know, because most of the emissions reduction announcements have already been made, only China amongst the major polluters has yet to make its to announce its NDC, its nationally determined contribution. But even if it makes a reasonably significant one, we know that we still won't be on that 1.5 degree trajectory. The UK government's aim is to what it calls keep 1.5 centigrade alive. That is, that there should be a collective level of emissions reductions commitments to 2030, 2035, which make the limit of global heating to 1.5 degrees still achievable. Not likely, not probable, but still achievable. And that seems to be about the most that we can expect and that the UK government is seeking at the COP. Secondly, the UK government does want the 100 billion to be finally reached. We have to say it's not clear how that's possible, although it may be that some of the SDRs, the special drawing rights that the International Monetary Fund has agreed, could be given towards climate, and that might be a way of closing the gap between that 80 billion plus the US's recent commitment and the 100 billion. So the UK is going to want to see higher climate finance commitments. And they also want to do something which would be pretty much unique to this COP. That is, they want to bring some real economy commitments into the COP process. And they have 4 priorities. Firstly, they want governments and companies to commit to stop building and financing coal-fired power stations. Coal, as you know, is the most polluting fuel, and we have effectively, the world has to get out of coal if it's going to have any chance of a 2 degree or a 1.5 degree trajectory. And the UK government wants countries and companies to commit to this. Interestingly, China has done so in terms of at least building coal-fired power stations outside China. That was the announcement which President Xi made at the UN General Assembly a couple of days ago. Not quite sure what that means in terms of financing or indeed in terms of China's own coal-fired power stations. But it's clearly a good thing, and the UK government would have been pushing them quite hard to do that. Secondly, they want governments and companies to commit to accelerating the phase out of the internal combustion engine, petrol and diesel cars. The UK has committed to no more internal combustion engine cars being sold after 2030. Other countries have some targets for a bit later than that. They want as many countries and car manufacturers globally to do that. Still, of course, will leave a huge stock of cars that are still running on petrol and diesel, but it would be a big shift in the making. Thirdly, they want financial institutions and investors to scale up the private finance flowing to emissions reduction and to adaptation and resilience. And lastly, they want governments and companies to commit to slowing the rate of deforestation. And Boris Johnson reiterated these 4 goals in his speech at the Younger UN General Assembly yesterday. So pictorially, this is what I think the government is trying to do. It's trying to enlarge the negotiations to take into account the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, the emissions reduction commitments and climate finance commitments, and the real economy commitments which countries and companies are making. And in that way, to solve the problem by bringing these things into the negotiations. And I think they will be trying to find a decision. Sometimes this has now been referred to as the Glasgow Pact, which can bring all of those things together in the on the conference floor at the end. There are some other issues which you should look out for here, which may come to the fore at certain points. One of them is what the developing countries call loss and damage. Even if they can adapt to climate change, most of them are struggling to do so, most developing countries will still experience tremendous damage and loss from climate change. And the question they have asked is, how are we compensated for this, given that we did not cause this and it's been caused by developed countries largely? How will we get, in that sense, climate justice? Some people have said this should be taken to courts, that is, that this should be a legal process in which developed countries are held in court liable for the damage they've caused. As you can imagine, the developed countries are very anxious to avoid that. Another issue which will emerge at the conference is on carbon markets and offsetting. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this. It's occurred a lot about in the discussion about net zero commitments that companies are making. The carbon market is where developed countries and businesses can buy emissions reductions in developing countries, for example, things like tree planting, to cut their emissions without actually cutting their own emissions. That is, to buy somebody else's emissions reductions. And that is the way, for example, the aviation sector is seeking to move towards net zero, not by reducing its own emissions, but by buying other countries' and other people's emissions. This is controversial. Many developing countries don't want to see this. And globally, we've got a lot of companies saying they are moving towards net zero, when in fact what they're mainly doing is offsetting. And there simply isn't enough space in the world to offset all of those emissions. So we have a risk here that a lot of these net zero commitments are greenwashing. And there will be a lot of concern about this as the rules for the carbon market are negotiated. Another issue that I think will emerge is the role of China, much now the world's largest polluter, an economy still growing rapidly and with high carbon investments all over the world in its so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Traditionally, China was part of the G77 group of developing countries, which is many more than 77 now. And it's, of course, an economic rival to the US. What is China going to commit to? How will it be treated, not just by the developed countries, which are in a kind of geopolitical competition with it, but also by the developing countries who need China to effectively act now like a developed country? That is going to be, I think, a really interesting thing to watch. And then lastly, what's the media narrative? What I think is interesting about this COP is that over the last few years since Paris, it's been harder and harder to claim that some action is enough action. The world's developing and developed countries are acting on climate change. It's no longer true to say no action is occurring. But we know from the IPCC that it isn't enough. And the problem, I think, that countries have here, particularly the rich world, including the UK, is that the standard for what is good enough is now very clearly with the science. The scientists, the IPCC, have said this. We've got very good spokespeople now for the climate science, like Greta Thunberg, even now David Attenborough, eventually. And therefore, the media, I think, will have a very clear test of whether the COP26 has succeeded, which is, are we on a trajectory to 1.5 degrees? Is there enough climate finance to help the developing world? And the answer will be no. And that answer will come very clearly for the scientists, from Greta Thunberg and from other commentators. And I think the UK government, as the presidency, will clearly want to say COP26 has been a triumph, but I think it will really struggle to do so, given the commitments that we know have been made, and this very clear story that is coming from the scientists and from the climate environmental NGOs and the climate justice movement about what is sufficient. And I think the question then is, if COP26 is perceived by the media to have failed, what does this mean for climate activism and environmental politics? You could see a failure, meaning that there is a redoubling of effort, public concern, and so on, or you could see a failure as after Copenhagen, which actually leads to people feeling as if nothing is going to happen and people becoming more fatalistic and companies not bothering about these commitments and so on. So I think that the politics of this is really interesting, and I wondered whether that might be one of the things we could talk about in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And that was an absolutely clear and I think brilliant introduction to everything. Just a reminder to people, there's two ways of asking questions. You can either put a comment in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll try and roughly take people in the order, certainly the order they appear in my list anyway. But just to pick up on your last point there, because that's one of the things that I think we as political actors in this whole game, and as I think your diagrams very clearly showed, the public and campaigners, like I think I could probably say everyone on this call, really do have a role in this. How do we balance? I can remember after Copenhagen, I was the editor of the Guardian Weekly then, and there was a sense of total despair. This had failed, and there was a couple of years of a real freeze. So how do you think we balance this of saying, you know, of managing expectations, of rewarding and celebrating countries and people have done good things, whilst also saying we need much more?
I think this has always been the problem for the environmental movement. This isn't an old problem, but it's more acute now, in the sense that governments never do enough if you're an environmentalist. But on the other hand, you do want to reward them when they do something that is good. Otherwise, they will, as Gordon Brown always used to say to me, if I don't get any reward from this, because Friends of the Earth and others always used to criticize him, not unfairly, but if I don't get any political reward for this, you know, what's my incentive to do it? And of course, I would say to him, it's the right thing to do. Wasn't always convincing. But this is, in a way, the core issue, which is how do we turn a COP, which is not going to do enough, but where things will be done, into a kind of stepping stone towards stronger action and not weaker action. The failure of Copenhagen pushed the climate movement and climate action backwards. There's no question that many companies gave up on the UN. They didn't feel as if there was any need to do things. A lot of NGOs turned away from climate after Copenhagen, stopped emphasizing climate, which was extraordinary. And so we need to find a way of failure becoming a spur to stronger action. And I think in that respect, the climate movement, Green Party activists, environmental activists have a crucial role to play, because what we need to be demanding is that this has failed to achieve where we really need to be, even though there will be some progress, and therefore we need to redouble our efforts and to commit to doing that. One way of this occurring in the COP does seem to me to bring forward the date of the next review. So at the moment, this is a 5-year cycle. So the next set of commitments that countries would be expected to make would be 2025. One option, and I think this may be something that the developing countries and the vulnerable countries demand, is that that's too late. If we're not on track, we need to come back earlier, say 2023, with stronger commitments. And that could be the demand that the environmental movement makes of the countries here. And I have to say, if that's picked up by the climate vulnerable countries or put forward by them, I think that will be very hard for the developed countries and China, and India, which won't want to agree to that, to resist that. So this is a really important moment, that there is enough commitment outside the conference to push the conference towards stronger action in the future.
Thanks very much for that. And I think, I mean, what your reply kind of hinted at was that we have to regard all of this as a process. And I think we have moved on politically. If you think, you go back to, say, for example, the Iraq War March, and, you know, I've met lots of people over the years who said, well, I went on the Iraq War March and it didn't stop Tony Blair going to war. So therefore, you know, I've given up on protest. And there was the idea that you could do one thing and get a concrete outcome. And of course, the world doesn't work like that. It's much more of a process. And if we just regard COP26 as part of this ongoing process over decades, I think that's a kind of healthier way to look at it, so we don't end up in that point of failure. And I think also, I mean, what you were saying about rewarding politicians and also rewarding campaigners and acknowledging when we've won. I thought I had a win in the House of Lords a couple of weeks ago, because Zach Goldsmith, the government DEFRA environment minister, turned to me and said, well, as Baroness Bennett always says, campaigning works. And that's a hashtag that I use very often. And, you know, when we have a win, it's really important we celebrate the win. You know, we very often want to say, well, yes, the government's done that as we asked, but it's not good enough. but celebrate the win first, and then a day or two later get on to the, yes, this is a win, but we want more kind of thing, because otherwise people feel like we're always losing. And actually we're, as Julia Hartley Brewer said to me a couple of interviews back, everyone's talking green now. She was very grumpy about that fact. I think also you talked about the place of China and how the place of China has really changed in the climate talks. What about the US? And obviously this is very different with Biden's US compared to Trump's US. How would you rank sort of the US contribution thus far and what their contribution is likely to be?
It's the problem with the US is that even under Democratic presidents, they're never doing enough. That's because US politics, there are two reasons for that really. One is US politics is now completely split on climate change, as people will be aware. It's become part of the kind of culture war between the Republicans and Democrats. So whether or not you believe in climate change and want to see any action on it, almost entirely now in the US splits down party lines. And the Republican Party has allowed itself to become an anti-climate action party. And the second reason is that presidents don't control the agenda, the legislative agenda in the US. It's Congress. And with the Democrats on a knife edge in Congress and quite a lot of quite conservative Democrats, it's really difficult to get climate legislation and climate finance through Congress. So yes, President Biden has said all the right things on climate change, and he's appointed John Kerry as his climate envoy. And there is a very strong move coming from the left of the Democrats for stronger action. He still has to get all of those commitments through Congress, including the money that he's announced a couple of days ago. He can promise that, but he can't deliver it unless Congress delivers it. And if you look at the US commitments, they are well behind the EU's commitments on both emissions reduction and finance. A lot of the US states are doing things independently of the federal government, but still the US's actions don't match up. So it's brilliant to have the US back as a pro-climate actor, but it is still not doing enough. And our problem as kind of allies of the US in the EU, when we were in the EU, when I was a negotiator, is that you are desperately trying to get the US to do more when it is saying, we're the good guys now. And that has always been a tension between the EU and the US. So the US is better than it was, but it's not nearly good enough.
And just sort of following on from that, I mean, China, as you said, is now a really major actor in this. And I often look back on what Isabel Hilton, who I regard as a really useful source on China, talking about how we think of, obviously, it's this enormous, utterly undemocratic state, but it also doesn't necessarily, the centre may fairly well get the climate agenda, but it's not necessarily as in control of its regions as we might think. And the directives might come down from on high to cut pollution, to cut greenhouse gas emissions. But the provinces, the big cities people have their own agenda there, their own desire for growth, etc. So how do you see China? How much it's a monolith and how much there are actually local factors in China as well?
I would agree with that analysis. I think we know less about China than we used to. Under the previous regime before Xi, it was fairly clear that the top of the Communist Party wanted to act on climate change, largely for air pollution reasons. Air pollution has been a terrible, terrible problem in Chinese cities. And they wanted to get rid of air pollution, and that effectively meant cutting down on fossil fuels. It looked like through the 5-year plans, which the Chinese government publishes, that it had quite a strong trajectory of bearing down on emissions and was willing to, this is in the early part of the last decade, to try and peak Chinese emissions by 2020. Since Xi, I think that's less obviously true. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is this huge investment in the developing world, is an incredibly extractive, I mean, pretty much neo-colonial project in which they are trying to extract resources to serve Chinese growth. And they have been very careless as to the green agenda outside China. So they have built and financed a lot of coal-fired power stations, a lot of extraction, and so on. And internally, the growth imperative is still really strong, and they have done a lot of the low-hanging fruit. They still have very strong decarbonisation plans relative to business as usual, as it were, but I think it's less clear what role decarbonisation and the climate agenda is now playing in the leadership's view.
Yes, China is a very interesting issue overall, speaking as the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group in Hong Kong, which I've been talking about this evening, but that's another issue. So I'm going to come to questions now. Just a reminder to people, I'll be picking questions up out of the chat, or if you'd like to ask them yourself, raise your hand with the blue hand function on the participants box. But going to a question here from Johan. The question is, you touched on it in the talk, but how does COP differ from other international governments or financial institutions in representing the smaller or global South nations? How do rich nations influence the negotiations, and how successful are they in setting the agenda? So is the balance of power a bit different in COP to other places?
It definitely is different in COP from, I've been in World Trade Organization negotiations, and small, poor countries have absolutely no voice in those whatsoever. At a COP, because of this, the twin features of a COP, so one is the issue of climate change gives the poorest and most vulnerable countries a kind of moral high ground. As I once said, for some of them, it's the only high ground they have on the issue, which is not the case on other questions. And secondly, decisions are made by consensus, which means that in theory, at least, everybody has to agree. So in practice, the developing countries have a kind of veto. And the combination of those two factors makes COPs very different from most other international negotiations, and it has worked. So in Paris, the final agreement was drawn up by and kind of pushed by what became known as the High Ambition Alliance. And that was an alliance of the small island developing states, the Africa Group, with the EU and the progressive Latin American countries. And that grouping, basically a European and climate vulnerable alliance, got the US to do things that the US did not want to do, and also got China and India to agree to an agreement they did not want to have. And that was rather remarkable. One of the Filipino negotiators said this was the ants moving the elephant. You know, if you've got enough ants underneath an elephant, all the ants can move the elephant. And in that sense, you do have, if well organized, and it has to be well organized, and of course it has to have some developed country allies, you do have the possibility in a COP of poorer and the most vulnerable countries influencing them. And we've seen COPs where countries that are really minuscule, like the Marshall Islands, which actually led the High Ambition Alliance in Paris, or Tuvalu, which I can tell you most people in the world of climate know that Tuvalu is an important country in the climate negotiations, but they couldn't tell you where Tuvalu was on a map to within 2,000 miles radius. They become important. So it is different, but of course there is also a lot of manipulation going on. And every country that gets aid from the US or the EU or the UK or China is under pressure. All the oil producing nations are under pressure from the Saudis and the Russians. And it's a pretty brutal kind of process at times. So yes and no. Sometimes the developing countries, the poorest countries, have a lot of clout, and other times they are effectively silenced by the bigger powers that can hold them to ransom over aid.
Thanks very much. And I mean, it's interesting. I think that in Paris, 1.5 was seen as a sop to those smaller nations and the island nations. And yet now really the science has moved on so much that now it's actually seen as the essential for everybody. And things like coral reefs, and indeed this kind of, fires, floods, droughts we're seeing under 1.1 degrees that we've got now. If we get out of the end of this at the other side and it all kind of works out, that Paris 1.5 will be, a really key point from the science side of things as well. Just a question here from Graham, which I can sort of partially answer, but any news of those from the Global South being excluded from COP due to COVID? I've personally seen a lot of discussion through the Global Greens, because the UK is supposed to be providing vaccinations for people, and that system doesn't seem to be working very well from what I've seen. I don't know what you've heard, Michael.
And of course, it isn't just for delegates. The UK government is promising all delegates will be vaccinated, but there are many other people from the Global South, from civil society and Global South, who want to come, who want to add their voices to the public voices, and many of those are not going to be able to come. So I think this will be raised as an issue. As you may have seen, the global environmental NGO network, CAN, the Climate Action Network, called last week or the week before for COP26 to be postponed because of this. They just felt it wasn't fair that people were effectively going to be excluded. The UK government rejected that, unsurprisingly, but I think it will be a big issue, and it will be raised on the conference floor at the very beginning of the conference, I'm sure.
Which kind of flows on to a question from Sophie, who said your outline was very useful, but asked how important are the protesters at COP? If the important decisions, lots of them, the NDCs have already been stated, etc., how much difference do the protests actually make?
Well, it's a good question, at one level, not much, because most of the really key decisions have been made. But at another level, it does ramp up the pressure on the negotiations themselves, and in particular on the leaders. So what we haven't mentioned yet is that the world leaders, so presidents and prime ministers, are coming to the COP at the beginning. So the first 2 days of the COP will be a global leaders summit. And it's really important that there are people on the streets whom the leaders can see as their cars go into the secure zone, and who are all over the media to tell the leaders that what they've so far done is not good enough. And that really is important. Leaders do pay attention to protest, and in the sense that those are the questions they will then get from the media, which will be reflected from the protest. So I do think it's really important. And in a way, if there isn't enough protest, that will convince some leaders that people don't really care and that they can get away with a conference that doesn't achieve very much. So in a sense, there's a kind of negative imperative on us to make our presence felt. So at least so that they can't say, look, not enough people really care about this. I think when the Conservative government decided to hold the COP in the UK, it believed that it would be able to pull off a successful conference, because most of the public don't really care enough about the issue, and that they could command the media narrative. And it's up to us to make sure that that is not an outcome that they can achieve.
Very much so. And I think also, I mean, it's interesting because probably the biggest demonstrations will also be in the middle weekend of COP. Indeed, I was talking to someone about coming up for that weekend. And, particularly anyone on this call who's got friends in Glasgow or environs. Edinburgh's only an hour away by train. If you're able to get up for that middle weekend, that's often a really important weekend of protest as well. If you'd agree with that, Michael? Yes,
absolutely. I mean, because of COVID, there's not going to be the scale of demonstrations that I would have said. I mean, 2 years ago, I was saying to the NGOs, we should be trying to get 1 million people on the streets. And I think without COVID, that would have been possible. I think enough people care about climate to do that. It won't be those numbers now, but it is important. There will be demonstrations in that middle week, and I do think they're absolutely crucial.
Okay. So I think we've got a couple of questions here that kind of are interrelated, so I might put them together. Basri asked to elaborate, this could be a whole session on its own, but on the political economy of foreign aid from a green perspective, ecological aid and green training, which I think I have to note that actually just this afternoon came out some figures showing that our cut from 0.7% of GNP to 0.5% of GNP is basically entirely hit on climate finance and inequalities, which is very disturbing. And also, I think some interesting figures here from Tim talking about how much the world spends on arms and armaments each year, comparative to climate action. And I'll also just feed into this, something I was having a discussion about this week. One of the things we see is global north countries and China saying, oh, we're getting rid of this polluting steel plant or this polluting coal-fired power station or something, and very often shipping that off to the global south, sometimes as aid, which is really just transferring the emissions around. So that whole political economy of aids to the global south, how it works and how it compares to arms, there's a big question in there, but try and keep it to a few minutes.
I will do, and I'm also conscious that the very first question came from Liam about the UK's role as presidency, which we might want to cover. So, I mean, as Natalie says, it's a big subject. The answer is that over the last 10 years or so, there has been much more attention paid in foreign aid that comes from the UK, from the EU, from most other developed countries, to environmental concerns. There's money now, considerable sums of money, as we saw, even if not enough to match the promises, that go towards climate, whether that's adaptation or emissions reduction. And there is much more sensitivity to the environmental impact of other forms of aid, of trying to get more sustainable agriculture and so on. So I do think that there has been a process of greening of aid, but it's not gone nearly far enough, as you would expect. And that's partly because most developing countries are conflicted on this in just the way that developed ones are. They want growth, they want rapid growth, they've got rapidly growing populations, particularly young populations, and they are often very careless of their natural environment in pursuit of growth. And foreign aid can do a certain amount to mitigate that, but in the end, foreign aid is not meant to be at the service of the donor countries. It's meant to be at the service of the recipient countries, and they are not all green. So this is a very complex picture, and obviously, you know, we could talk about this for much longer. There is a geopolitics of aid. There is no question that aid is a form of power relationship, that countries that receive aid are in some ways beholden to the countries that provide aid, and to the institutions that provide aid. We know that the World Bank and the IMF have often been very regressive in the kinds of aid that they've given and so on. So aid is part of geopolitics, no question, and that's not just true for Western developed countries, that's also true for China. China has now huge obligations effectively created around the developing world from all the money that it's been investing and providing. So that is very much a part of the kind of background to the COP. Answering the question about where the 100 billion came from and how that number relates to spending on arms, for example, it is of course much less than is spent on arms per year. The answer to where the number came from is, I can tell you, because I was in the meetings which decided that number, or first came up with that number. In fact, I probably got the envelope on the back of which we first wrote it. Gordon Brown came up with that number in 2009, as we were approaching the Copenhagen conference, which was meant to be the next big international agreement. The developing countries were saying they needed finance of 300 to 400 billion a year, and the developed countries, including the EU and the US, were saying that they thought the sum of money should be about 30 or 40 billion. And negotiations were completely deadlocked around that. And Gordon simply wanted to break the deadlock. And so we came up with a number that was somewhere between the 30 and 40 billion of the developed countries and the 300 to 400 of the developing ones. And we found a way of justifying the 100 billion. It wasn't actually just a number plucked out of thin air, but it kind of was. But it had the effect of getting a number around which agreement could be reached, and in the sense that unblocked those negotiations, that some of the developing countries said, look, that's not bad, and the developed countries hated it, actually, really hated it. And Gordon did this without any consultation with them. He just announced it. It was a success, but of course it is too little. And if you look at the kinds of estimates that the developing countries or the NGOs estimate for how much money is needed to adapt to climate change or to reduce emissions in developing countries, it's huge. It runs into the trillions. And of course, some of that can come from private finance. There is some investment opportunity, but the numbers that are being provided are nothing like the kinds of numbers that would really support the developing world to do this, which is why there is such a sense of injustice around this, and why climate finance is always such a controversial part of COPs and will be at COP26.
Yes, and I think in the Green Party we often frame this as sort of part of reparations for, you know, not just loss and damage for all of the climate damage done by our and other global North countries' emissions, but also the damage of colonialism, the damage of post-colonialism, multinational companies. One of my pet things I'm often working on is the issue of corruption, and people think this is a global South problem, but actually when you ask who pays the money almost invariably comes from the global North. So Umberto has somewhat taken issue with what I said about rewarding governments for doing a little. Would it work better to really, come down like a ton of bricks and say, you haven't done enough, you've got to pay a political electoral price for this? What's your thoughts on the balance between rewarding what they have done and saying it's not enough?
I think this is changing. I think as the clarity of what needs to be done is become stronger, and we have a very now a scientific consensus on what that is. Government shouldn't be rewarded simply for doing something. Unfortunately, in politics, you get 80% of the reward in politics from doing something. And most politicians think if they can say in response to the problem, we're doing something, that will be enough. And we know that it isn't enough, and the inadequacy of the commitments that are currently being made is leading us into a really, really dangerous situation. So I now would say that in regard to COP26, which is what we're talking about, we shouldn't say these commitments are enough, and we shouldn't reward them for doing them. We should say this is inadequate. Where I think I would put some nuance on that is that you do need to acknowledge that something is being done for the reasons that Natalie said about the pressure that is applied. The fact that anything is being done is largely a result of public concern and pressure from NGOs, from scientists and so on. And it really isn't a good idea, in my view, to tell the public who are protesting, who do care about it, you're always failing because not enough is being done. I felt this very strongly after Paris, where Friends of the Earth International said Paris was terrible. And I just thought that is an awful thing for Friends of the Earth to say to its own supporters, whose actions over the previous 5 years, 6 years, had definitely pushed governments to a much stronger agreement than they would otherwise have made. And to tell all of your supporters that you failed, despite the fact that you haven't failed, you've achieved something, I think is a very bad way of getting people to feel it's worth campaigning. So I do think we need to be telling our supporters, even though this isn't adequate, we have moved them. And that's an important part of the process, because it's true.
Yeah, indeed. So I left Liam's question to the last because I kind of didn't want to get too distracted into British issues. We're trying to focus on COP. But Liam asks, how important is the UK as the COP presidency? Liam suggests I would agree that the UK on shaky ground, talking the talk, but not walking the walk, with poor climate decisions on things like coal and oil. And I'm also going to pull in here the question, if I can find it now, or the comment from Peter, saying that Boris Johnson will come out with positive messages. How do we make sure there's a reality check on this and that it's in the public arena? So how do we manage the domestic politics of COP? And, I actually have a piece in Left Foot Forward tomorrow focusing on Boris's speech in the UN General Assembly and saying, well, if you said all of that, well, you better allow all the Lord's amendments to the Environment Bill. So how would you see that, being able to use that, and how important is what happens in the UK in the next 6 weeks going into COP?
So I think there are two elements here. One is, what is the UK doing domestically, and does that help or undermine its efforts as the UK presidency? And actually, what is it doing as the UK presidency? So on the first of them, the answer is a bit mixed, because the UK's statistical record on emissions reduction, by comparison with most developed countries, isn't bad. Most of that occurred, as we know, through the dash for gas in the 90s and so on. But our record of reducing emissions isn't bad. And our commitments to do so in the future are stronger than almost all other large developed economies. Now, as we know, we're not hitting our emissions, but if you look at our emissions reduction commitments, both the net zero by 2050, which is of course in statute in the UK, unlike in most countries, and the 2035 carbon budget, those are very ambitious by the standards of most developed countries. And the UK never tires of saying that. Most countries are not following the domestic politics of other countries very much. So the fact that the UK is not achieving these commitments will not be as well known. But the foreign aid cut is, of course, very well known internationally, and that has been extremely damaging. There's no question that a country that cuts its foreign aid doesn't look like a country that is trying to tackle the global climate issue, or to support developing countries in doing so. And that was a terrible, terrible diplomatic error in the year that we were the presidency of the COP. And that has definitely been noticed. So I think the picture is mixed on whether the UK sufficiently walks the walk as well as talking the talk. In terms of its role as the presidency, it is really, really important. The chair of the COP stops being a developed country or a developing country or in a particular bloc, and is the facilitator, the mediator between all the other blocs and countries to try and reach an agreement. And because of domestic politics, which is pretty much pro-climate change, domestic media, which is pretty much pro-climate change, the UK would like as ambitious an agreement at the COP as possible. And so the UK's role in mediating between the countries, trying to find ambitious solutions is very important. France, which had that role in Paris, obviously in 2015, played a blinder as far as that was concerned. A really, really skilled diplomatic effort with, as I said, the High Ambition Alliance of developing countries and the EU helping it, but nevertheless, bringing all those countries together around a high ambition agreement was very much a triumph of the French, and the UK will be hoping to do something similarly. And I have to say that Alok Sharma, who is the actual president of the COP, is pretty well respected around the world. I know there was some criticism of him for traveling all over the world. I have to say he absolutely had to do that. You can't do this if you've met these other ministers only over Zoom. And I think he is not a bad person, given the choice available in the governing party for doing this. But in the end, the presidency can only mediate between what countries are willing to do. And so the limiting factor will be, again, China, the US, the EU, and the bloc of developing countries.
Yes, and I think that also the team of civil servants who are doing a lot of the work. I mean, I've met some of them at the top of the team, and they are a very impressive group of people who certainly have their hearts and their minds in the right place. Although, of course, as civil servants, they can only do, in a sense, at one level, what they're directed. So I think we've had a large amount of agreement here between you and I, Michael, this evening. So that now we might as well, in the last minute or two, go into the where we might find some points of disagreement, because it's a very old green saying that say that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And I know many people on this call would think that we really have to get away from the drive for growth, the growth imperative, at least obviously in the global north. Global south is a different question. And, I've been thumping away in the House talking about the New Zealand Living Standards Framework as a different way of guiding the Treasury. And on the Environment Bill, we brought in an amendment in the Lords that would ensure that the Treasury is actually covered by the Environment Bill, as it explicitly isn't at the moment. So what's your thoughts on whether we can get away from a growth narrative and really get to something different?
I'm very much in favour of getting away from the growth narrative and the growth imperative. Growth doesn't give us what we want. And that's the realisation that I think has been so clear over the last decade or more, which is that even if you've got growth, it obviously creates environmental problems, but it also doesn't give you greater well-being, it doesn't reduce inequality, and it certainly doesn't give you resilience. Growth in itself is not a good. Growth has only ever had value because it has provided other things. And mostly the patterns of growth that we've had over the last decade or 2 decades, or possibly 4, have not given us those things that we want. So I talk of myself as a post-growther. I think growth is no longer a useful framework for us. That is not just about the indicators we use for economic progress, which are obviously important, but actually the type of policies. And the work that I've been doing over the last few years, the book Rethinking Capitalism with Mariana Mazzucato was one, the IPPR Commission on Economic Justice, which was another, have been attempts to show how you can organize an economy to get the things we really want, which is environmental sustainability, a reduction in inequalities, better well-being, and greater resilience. I've written something on the OECD called Beyond Growth recently, which sets all that out. I think that's very important. And in a way, I just want to get beyond the growth debate, neither pro-growth nor degrowth, but let's focus on the things we actually want. And then we will find out whether there's any growth left available. And I have to say the Environment Bill is really important in this, because I suppose the thing I've been arguing for 30 years since my very first book, which was called The Green Economy in 1991, is that we need to place environmental constraints around the economy. The only way to get sustainability is to identify where those environmental limits, or planetary boundaries as we tend to call them now, where they lie, and to insist that the government doesn't exceed them. And to do that, you have to have a framework of law which makes it illegal for governments to run an economy which exceeds those limits. Now, that's what we did with the Climate Change Act, and I'm very proud of having had something to do with that, because the Climate Change Act doesn't always work in practice, but does set a legal framework which says this is going to be our total emissions on a declining path, measured in 5-year carbon budgets, and the government is legally obliged to produce plans to reach those limits. We haven't done that for the rest of the environment, for biodiversity, for soil fertility, for ocean pollution, and so on, but we need to. And that's what the Environment Bill at its best could be. It could be what I've called in other writing a Sustainable Economy Act, which places planetary boundaries around the UK economy by law. And the Environment Bill has been watered down from within the government, even from its first incarnations. And as you say, the Treasury, the one department that absolutely must abide by the Sustainable Economy Act, is excluded from it. So good luck to you, Natalie, in getting those amendments through the government. Hold Boris Johnson to his flowery words yesterday, but we've still got a lot to do to move towards a post-growth economy, as I would say.
Very much indeed. And I think that's a great point to finish on, where we've got to the point where we haven't really found anything we disagree on. So yeah, we haven't so much had a debate as a discussion, and I think it's been a very useful one and some great questions, and thank you everyone for that. I'm just going to put in a couple of adverts. I stuck a link in the chat. People might know about the Wellbeing petition, which has, I think last I looked, nearly 65,000 signatures. It's only got a few days to get to the 100,000 to force a debate. So I really would encourage people to sign and share that. It's something Caroline Lucas particularly has been driving. And if we can do that, you know, someone said, oh, you've got to get it to use it to beat a stick to beat the Tories with. And I'm afraid we've also got to beat pretty hard on the Lib Dems and Labour as well. So parliamentary debate would be quite useful on that one. So I think we've had, I think, a really good discussion. I think as a chair, I've run a couple of minutes over. I'm going to allow you, Michael, if someone asked, you know, what would be a successful COP? So I'm going to ask you perhaps, you know, in a minute to wrap us up finally, if you, you know, were there lying in your dreams having the most amazing, wonderful outcome from COP, you know, what would that look like? What would 3 things in a wonderful outcome from COP look like, that we can all, you know, since we're finishing up the evening, go home and dream them tonight? Mass
demonstrations in the middle weekend, which tell the politicians and the leaders that there is huge public concern. Some additional commitments from the ones that we've seen already. So actually the leaders to say things that they haven't said before, which shows that a COP is a moment when leaders are forced to take it seriously. And I would say a review process that is speeded up. So the outcome of the COP is a recognition that it's not done enough, and a commitment to come back earlier than we would otherwise have done in order to redouble our efforts earlier than the 5-year cycle that is currently in the plan. I think a combination of those 3 things would enable us to say that the COP has not been a failure. I think it's going to be very hard to say it's been a success, but it's been something that we can use to take forward to stronger action in the future. Well, that's brilliant. And the first one of those is something everyone on this call in some way or another can contribute to. And I'll also put a little advert in. There was a link in the chat also to the climate strikes tomorrow. I'm afraid I won't be in Sheffield. I'll be at the one in London for various logistical reasons. But, you know, getting out, supporting those young people who really can see the acute urgency of action now. So it only really falls to me now to say thank you very much to Michael, a man who's very much in demand at the moment, for giving up his time to be with us with Sheffield Greens this evening. Thank you for everyone who's come along. Thank you to Eamon and Liam for organising this and making it all happen. And I'm going to hand back to Liam now in case there's anything other administrative that needs to be done. But thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Natalie. Not that I know of, just to say from me a big thank you to Michael and to yourself, Natalie, as well, for being here and giving us all these great insights. I really appreciate it. And thanks for your time. And thanks everybody else for being here as well. Good night.